A picture is worth 1,000 words. That an image can communicate much more than just what a lot of verbiage can do. Now, many people have considered Pope Francis a pope of gestures. And I think the gestures that he makes are to bring people close to home. Now, beginning on March 13th, 2013, the beginning of his pontificate, when he came out on the loggia at the Basilica in front of 200,000 people, before he bowed down and asked the people to pray for him before he gave his papal blessing, he asked everyone to pray one Our Father, one Hail Mary, one Glory be for Pope Benedict, because now he was a retired pope. It's easy to forget those who've been actively involved. So what a remarkable gesture praying for the Pope, retired Pope Benedict. And then later on November 6th and November 20th, so every Wednesday the Pope has an audience. And in those 2 weeks, he invited disfigured people to come to him. On November 6th, it was a gentleman by the name of Vinicio Riva. And you may have seen the picture of him. He's got all these boils on his face, in fact on his whole body. And he has terrible time sleeping because of the pain he's in. In fact, when he wakes up in the morning, his bed sheets are just full of sweat because of his agony. And Pope Francis made a gesture to him to bring him to his bosom and just hugged him and said, almost implying, hey, you are loved. Even though you're disfigured, you are still someone of dignity. You are a child of God. And then 2 weeks after that, November the 20th, 2013, there was a man who had been shot in the face, and so his whole face is remarkably disfigured. And again, Pope Francis brought him into his bosom and said, you are a child of God. Even though he didn't have to communicate any words, that gesture implied, hey, you have a home with me. You have a home with God. Now, Pope Francis made a trip to the Holy Land on May the 25th, 2014. And the great image of him touching the wall that separates Palestine from Israel and praying there, that almost saying these walls have to come down. So people that are different of faith, different of ethnicities can eventually come together. And probably my favorite gesture is, and this is no accident, Pope Francis' first trip outside of Rome was not to the United States, not to any foreign country, but in fact Lampedusa, Italy, on July the 8th, 2013. And there he threw a wreath into the ocean on his way to Lampedusa. It's the southernmost island in Italy. And it's a similar place where immigrants go in order to be processed before they can enter into Europe. And so some of you may be familiar with Ellis Island in New York or Pier 21 in Halifax, the reception of immigrants into the new land. And when Pope Francis was getting news about how many people were dying on the way from North Africa, fleeing persecution to seek liberation, that he says that it was like a thorn was in his heart. And he really wanted to make a plea that immigrants who were fleeing persecution would be able to find a home where there's safety. And in his speech, he condemned kind of the indifference of globalization, or even the culture of comfort, that there's no responsibility for those who are seeking exile from persecution and want to go home. So Pope Francis is a pope of gestures because he wants to bring exiles home. And the things that he does are a reminder, hey, that to bring people home is to bring people to Jesus. Likewise for us, Advent prepares exiles to return home to Jesus. Now, exile I think, exile or even pilgrimage is really the idea of all humanity. We want to go home. We don't want to be traveling. I mean, traveling is okay. We want to go home. And ultimately, home is with God, and also with those who believe in God. And in our first two passages from Scripture today, we talk about the kinds of exiles that people can experience. Our first reading was taken from the 40th chapter of the book of the prophet Isaiah, which scholars consider, they would term that section from 40 to 55, the book of consolation, 2nd Isaiah. Okay, with 2nd Isaiah, how is that different from 1st Isaiah, the first part of Isaiah? Well, the first part of Isaiah really talks about what happened in the northern kingdom of Israel, the 10 tribes of Israel, And what happened to them? Well, in about the year 750, the Assyrian Empire came, took the 10 tribes of Israel, the northern kingdom, and wiped them off the face of the earth. Why? Well, they didn't love God and didn't love neighbor. And so the Lord said, if you want to be away from me, if you want to be exiles, you'll see what happens. And they were taken away. 2 centuries later, the southern kingdom, as if they didn't learn the lesson from the northern kingdom, didn't love God and didn't love neighbor. So what happened? They chose to exile themselves from God, and they became exiles themselves in Babylon. So after 70 years, they finally get it. Okay, we are not following our command to love God and love neighbor. We want to come back home. And so this passage from the 40th chapter of Isaiah is God's desire to bring people home, and not just casually, directly. And so the famous passages of a highway in the desert, of filling up the valleys and making the mountains slow, making a straight way for the Lord. Well, that's exactly what the Lord wants to do. He wants these exiles to come home so quickly, not to take the established longer route, but to come home directly. It's like, come on, come away from your exile and come back home to the land of milk and honey, the promised land. So exile is the physical separation. So the first, this book from Isaiah is the return of the Israelites back home in Babylon. And then our psalm today, Psalm 85, Lord, give us your salvation, is now the people have returned home and they've thought spiritually about what happened. Why were they exiles? And they even ask in that psalm, Lord, will your anger be with us forever? Because they realize how they've exiled themselves from God, and now they want to spiritually return home. And so this wonderful prayer of the whole nation, asking God for forgiveness. And at the same time, it's also one of great blessing that the Lord bestows upon them, because they finally come to their senses. They're no longer spiritual exiles, but they've come home to God via their repentance. And so exile is both a physical one and a spiritual one for the Israelites. And it's always because exiles, nobody wants to be wandering. Everybody wants to go home. And so to be truly home is to be one with God. And so Advent prepares the way for exiles to come home. Now what about us? Okay, these stories were like 3,500 years old. Does this also apply to us? And I would say more so than ever. I mean, all of us have a desire to build a church. And I think the church ultimately is a place of exile, or a home for exiles. Physically, let's say in from the cold, or some other ways that we can help others. More so spiritually, that they have a home, that they are not spiritually wandering, but they do have a place. And even as we prepare for Jesus' birthday, I think many of us are busy with all the things that have to be done. And I think maybe if I can interject with all the planning, the shopping, the cooking, the celebrations and all that, you know, we ask the what and hows of how we're preparing for Christ's birthday. I think we should almost ask why. Why are we doing all these things? I think ultimately to give people a home with the Lord. And all the celebrations that we do, the gifts we do, or even a lot of the volunteering and charitable works, I think are ways that we can truly give people a home who are exiles, whether spiritually or even physically. But I think at the same time, we must realize that we were once exiles ourselves. So maybe some of us are spiritual exiles, even though we're still here. And I think the more that we come and prepare a home for Jesus in our lives, the more that in turn we can give a home for exiles in our world. I think the church during the season of Advent is a time of preparation spiritually. I think the church gives us a couple opportunities. And so we have the sacrament of reconciliation. The toughest, I think, of all the sacraments, because it's ultimately for us to realize, hey, Lord, and to tangibly say, here are the ways I've exiled my life from you and from my neighbor. And so the sacrament of reconciliation is an opportunity to come home to the Lord, to feel his embrace. And once we've asked him for forgiveness, we in fact can give forgiveness and mercy to our neighbor after encountering that call. And so on Friday we'll have our communal penitential service. But also on the Wednesdays of Advent, the bishop has asked all parishes to be available to celebrate the sacrament of reconciliation. So whether one comes here or elsewhere, it's that opportunity. Now we'll do it at the Rectory, 316 Windermere Drive, on Wednesdays from 7 to 8, for those who want to celebrate the sacrament of reconciliation. It's also an opportunity to pray. I mean, some of us are so busy preparing for Christmas, we almost lose the perspective of why we're celebrating the season. Well, it's to celebrate and prepare ourselves to encounter or re-encounter Emmanuel, God with us. And so for those who want to come on Wednesday between 7 and 8, there will also be the adoration of the Blessed Sacrament, an opportunity to come face to face with your Eucharistic Lord, and then to no longer be exiled from Him, but to draw closer to Him. And I think the more that we realize, hey, we have a home with God, the more so that we can share that home with others. I think it's also important for us to ask, who are the exiles in my life? And I'm sure we know people, whether it's at work, in our homes, in the community, that need a home. And for Christ the King, we heard that great judgment of the Lord, Matthew 25, about the exiles of society, the hungry, the thirsty, the naked, the imprisoned, the sick, the stranger. And I think if we open our eyes, and even before that, to allow the Lord into our hearts, He also raises our consciences to look at the people who are exiled, who are on the fringes of society, and welcome them home. And maybe it's a psychological gesture, emotional gesture, to give them a home, whatever we can do to make exiles feel home, to give them in turn an encounter with the Lord. And that's a whole reason for this season, to bring Jesus to others, so that He may give them a home for those who are exiled. Now, Pope Francis challenged the Church to not be so absorbed in the four walls of our worship community, but to go out into the fringes of society, to go where the exiles are, and to bring them home. And I think his gestures are far greater than the words that he would otherwise have to say. And I think for him, the exiles are the elderly, Pope Benedict, the disabled and disfigured, and the immigrants, and those who are separated politically. And he says, by his gestures, he is taking those exiles and bringing them home to the Lord. And so this week, let us take our encounter with the Lord today, with Emmanuel, God with us, and prepare exiles to encounter Jesus, who wants to give them a home. And so as we're nourished with the strength of His Word and His body and blood, let's bring exiles home to Jesus this Advent.